The story of the Hundred Years' War begins not with the clash of swords on a battlefield, but with the whispers of dynastic ambition, the tightening grip of political rivalries, and the restless stirrings of a continent caught between the medieval and the modern. For centuries, France had been the beating heart of European power, and England, though smaller, had begun to carve out its own influence across the Channel. What followed was a war that spanned more than a century, stretching across generations, fought by kings and peasants, knights and mercenaries, princes and prophets. It was a war of crowns and claims, of devastation and resilience, and it left scars on Europe that endured long after the last sword was sheathed. The roots of the conflict were tangled deep in dynastic bloodlines. In the year 1328, the French king, Charles IV, died without a male heir. By the tradition of the Salic law, which barred succession through the female line, the throne was claimed by Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. But across the Channel, another claimant rose. Edward III of England, grandson of the French king Philip IV, through his mother, Isabella of France, declared that his bloodline gave him the stronger claim. The French nobility rejected him, insisting that no woman nor her descendants could inherit the throne of France. What might have been settled with diplomacy instead ignited into a century of war. At first, the conflict was one of pride and position, but it soon escalated into a sweeping struggle for control of France itself. England, though smaller in population and wealth, held territories in France, including the rich Duchy of Aquitaine, and Edward III refused to bow as a vassal to the French king. The French crown, determined to assert its dominance, pressed Edward to yield. Instead, in 1337, Edward declared himself the rightful king of France, a bold claim that set two nations on a collision course. The war's early years were dominated not by grand campaigns, but by raids, skirmishes, and the weapon that would come to symbolize English might, the longbow. Unlike the heavily armored knights who had ruled European battlefields for centuries, English archers brought death from a distance. They were drawn not from the nobility but from common men, hardened in training, able to unleash a storm of arrows that could pierce even the thickest armor. This new reality of war would shatter old ideas of chivalry and redefine the balance of power. In 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, the longbow proved its worth. Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, led an English force against the larger French army. French knights, proud and armored, charged again and again, only to be cut down by volleys of arrows raining from the sky. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse. The flower of French chivalry lay broken in the mud, undone not by noble combat, but by the deadly efficiency of common bowmen. It was a harsh lesson, one France would struggle to accept. The English followed their victory with a siege of Calais, capturing the port city after a year of starvation and resistance. Calais would remain in English hands for over 200 years, a vital foothold on the continent. But even as England celebrated, a shadow fell over Europe. In 1347, the Black Death began to spread. The plague swept across the continent with terrifying speed, killing perhaps a third of Europe's population. The war slowed, armies dispersed, and both kingdoms struggled simply to survive. The land was scarred, villages emptied, entire families lost. War had been cruel, but the plague was merciless. When the conflict resumed, France was still reeling, but England pressed its advantage. In 1356, at the Battle of Poitiers, the Black Prince once again led the English to triumph. The French king, John II, was captured on the field, humiliated and taken to England as a prisoner. France was left leaderless, its countryside ravaged by English raids known as chevauchées, in which soldiers burned crops, looted villages, and left famine in their wake. It was not simply war between kings. It was war on the people themselves, designed to break the will of France. Desperate for peace, France signed the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, ceding vast territories to England and agreeing to a massive ransom for their king. For a time, it seemed that England had achieved what it sought, dominance over France. Yet peace in the 100 Years' War was always fragile, and the ambitions of kings rarely rested long. By the 1370s, the tide began to turn. Under the leadership of Charles V of France, known as the Wise, the French crown reorganized its forces, relying less on reckless charges of knights and more on disciplined strategic campaigns. French generals like Bertrand du Guesclin harassed the English with guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles where the longbow ruled supreme. Slowly, piece by piece, the French reclaimed lost lands. Edward III, once triumphant, grew old, and the momentum of war slipped away from England. Yet the 100 Years' War was not a single unbroken conflict. It was a series of wars, interrupted by truces, treaties, and uneasy lulls. Generations lived and died under its shadow, and each phase brought new kings, new strategies, and new tragedies. In England, the crown passed to Richard II, a boy king, and later to Henry IV and Henry V, whose ambitions would reignite the struggle with brutal force. Henry V of England, ascending to the throne in 1413, was a warrior king in the mold of his ancestors. Determined to assert his claim to the French crown, he invaded France in 1415. The campaign culminated in one of the most famous battles in history, Agincourt. The French army outnumbered the English, confident in their strength, but the muddy fields of northern France betrayed them. The heavily armored knights struggled in the mire, while English longbowmen unleashed devastation. The French fell in waves, crushed by their own weight and the relentless arrows. Thousands perished, and France's nobility suffered a catastrophe from which it would take decades to recover. Henry V emerged as a hero, his legend immortalized in chronicles and later in Shakespeare's words. In the aftermath, Henry forced France to its knees. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 declared him heir to the French throne, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles, the legitimate son of the French king. To secure his claim, Henry married Catherine of Valois, daughter of the French monarch. For a brief moment, it seemed that England and France would be united under a single crown. But fate would not allow it. Henry V died suddenly in 1422 at the age of 35, leaving an infant son as king. The dream of English rule over France rested on fragile shoulders. At this darkest hour for France, salvation came from the most unlikely of sources. A young peasant girl from Domremy. Joan of Arc claimed to hear divine voices urging her to save France. At first dismissed, she persuaded the Dauphin to let her lead an army. In 1429, she marched to the besieged city of Orléans, and against all odds, lifted the siege. Her presence, her conviction, and her faith transformed the morale of the French. She became the Maid of Orléans, a symbol of resistance and hope. Joan's victories paved the way for Charles VII to be crowned at Reims, restoring legitimacy to his reign. Yet her triumph was short-lived. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English, Joan was handed over, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. She was only 19 years old. Her death was a tragedy, but her legacy endured, galvanizing French resistance and forever altering the course of the war. After Joan's martyrdom, France grew stronger. Charles VII reformed the army, established a standing force, and relied increasingly on artillery, a weapon that heralded the dawn of a new age of warfare. Cannons battered down the walls of castles and cities that had once seemed impregnable, signaling the end of the medieval fortress. Slowly, systematically, France drove the English back. By the mid-15th century, England's hold on France was collapsing. Internal turmoil at home, including the Wars of the Roses, sapped its strength. One by one, French cities fell, and in 1453, at the Battle of Castillon, the French delivered the final blow. The English army was shattered, its commander killed, and the dream of an English kingdom in France crumbled to dust. The 100 Years' War was over. What remained was a Europe transformed. France emerged battered but unified, its monarchy strengthened, its identity forged in fire. England, though defeated, turned its gaze inward, reshaping its politics and society. The age of chivalry had ended, replaced by the rise of professional armies and the destructive power of gunpowder. The war had lasted 116 years, longer than the lives of those who fought it, longer than the memory of its first battles. Generations had known nothing but war, yet from its ashes rose the foundations of the modern nations we know today. The 100 Years' War was more than a struggle for crowns. It was the story of a continent in transition, of old orders collapsing and new powers rising. It was a war that devoured lives, shattered kingdoms, and yet gave birth to legends. From the muddy fields of Crécy and Agincourt to the burning stake of Joan of Arc, it remains one of history's most dramatic epics, a reminder that the march of history is written not only by kings, but by the countless souls caught in the tide of war.